So today is going to be another cooking one. We're going to be looking at my Linguine Cacciatori. Now, this particular recipe is based on a chicken-based marinara sauce served with linguine, and it's very easy to make. From start to finish, you're looking at 20-25 minutes. The quantity of sauce I'm going to be making is suitable for 4 people for one meal. Or if there's only 2 of you, you can literally allow the rest of the sauce to cool in the pot. And when it's at room temperature, that can go in the refrigerator. Cook up some additional pasta the next day, heat up that sauce to a nice bubble, mix them together, and you have a second meal that can be knocked out in 10-15 minutes. So it's a really good practical meal. Stay tuned. So to begin with, we'll have a look at our main ingredients. First of all, we have about 170 grams or about 6 ounces of chicken. This is pre-cooked and it's been diced. Then we have 1 shallot which has been sliced up. I know you can see one that's been sliced and one that's whole, but that's just to give you an idea of the size of shallot we're using. We only use the one that's sliced up. Then we come to the spices. The cayenne pepper is just a pinch, the rest are a heaped teaspoon. And starting from the 11 o'clock position, we have salt, pepper, sugar, basil, oregano, garlic granules, paprika, and in the center, parsley. And these are all prepared in advance. The cayenne pepper is nestled between the sugar and the basil on the right. So to begin with, we put all the ingredients together in the pot. And we're going to start off with a tin of tomatoes or tomatoes or however you may wish to pronounce it. And we're going to add the chicken. We're going to add the onions, or the spices. We're also going to add wine. This is a Chianti. I'm using about the equivalent of a glass of Chianti. We also want to add olive oil. Tomato puree, just a good squirt. And this is the only controversial ingredient. I do actually like to add just a quick squirt of ketchup. I know some people are horrified by that notion, but actually it does help balance all the flavors. And literally I'm just going to blend everything together to get a nice smooth consistency before I've even turned the heat on. And at this point it's now ready to cook, so I'm going to turn the heat on, put it up on full, and what I'm about to do is wait for this to come to a bubble. Now this needs to simmer rather than boil, and what I will do is bring it up to a bubble, then I'll reduce the heat a little bit, give it a stir, wait till it bubbles up again. Reduce the heat, give it a stir, wait till it bubbles up again. I do repeat this 2 or 3 times, 3 or 4 times, until I'm down to my simmer temperature. And when it then bubbles on the simmer, I give it a stir, and that's when I'm going to fill the second pan with water to begin to cook the linguine. But to begin with, we just let it slowly come to temperature. Now the reason why I will take it to the initial bubble on high and then reduce, give it a stir and wait for the bubbles again and so forth, is it does get at the temperature a little bit more quickly. I mean, one of the problems that you sometimes have when you're trying to simmer something is you can get bubbles appearing on the bottom, but the main body of the liquid isn't particularly heated up. This way I'm stirring the pot in a way that evens out the temperature throughout the pot, makes it everything heat up, and we're starting to get a little bit of bubbling here. Just let it get a little bit more intensive than that, but that's mostly coming from the bottom. The main body of the liquid here isn't particularly hot. But if I try to start off with a simmer temperature and bring it up to a simmer that way, it takes a very long time. And it's beginning to bubble moderately nicely, nothing too crazy. That's good. And before it gets crazy, I'm going to give it a quick stir. I'm going to lower the temperature a little. And of course, stirring it will now have evened out the temperature contained within there, and it isn't bubbling anymore, which is as we would expect. And again, just give it just a half a minute or so, maybe a minute at most, but it will start to bubble again. Each time we do this, we're raising the temperature of the whole pot, but we're doing it quickly without burning the bottom or overdoing it. Obviously, this is something that needs to be done with you watching it rather than, I'll just switch it on and walk away, because that's when it can boil over and this sort of problem occurs. It's just beginning to bubble, but again, we want it to be just a tiny bit more vigorous than that before we start actually lowering the temperature again. And obviously, I'm doing this particular thing of trying to let you see how I do this, because in real time, simply because obviously this, believe it or not, is perhaps the most complex bit to the whole thing. So it really, really is a supremely easy dish to make. I mean, basically what we have here is a chicken-based marinara sauce of low complexity but brilliant flavor. And obviously, if you do it without the chicken, it's just a pure marinara sauce. If you do it with beef, you have a bolognese sauce. So it's super easy to do this. You can also make a lamb bolognese by putting lamb in there instead of the chicken or instead of beef. You can use other types of meat as well, pork or venison, what have you. I would say, now it's just starting to come to a halfway decent little boil. Very, very slight still, but I'm going to give it a good stir. And lower the temperature a bit more. And I'm just going to wait for it to start bubbling again. And again, it's not complicated. I will say, as I'm using cooked chicken here. Again, if I were doing a bolognese, I would take the beef and I would fry it off in a pan before adding it to this. So if you are adding, the way I do it, the meat that's going in there is already cooked before I even begin. It's starting to bubble again, so I'll give it a little gentle stir. And lower the temperature. Actually, I'll put it down to my simmer temperature now, and it'll start to bubble again in a moment. I'm going to take the other pot and put water in that. And as is often the case with Italian cookery, the recommendation is to make it salty like the sea. So I'm going to take my salt and just a goodly batch of salt in there. Now I'm using sea salt because it doesn't taste any different from regular table salt, but it is actually nutritionally better because sea salt hasn't just got sodium chloride, it also has potassium chloride and other trace elements, so it is healthier. And by the way, the potassium and the potassium chloride undoes some of the damage that sodium chloride can do to your blood pressure. So it's actually a healthier option. In terms of flavor, it is identical to regular table salt. So if you only have table salt, while I don't recommend it as much as the sea salt, it certainly isn't going to harm the flavor at all. Now I'm just starting to see a little tiny bit of bubbling in the pot here. And so I'm going to now turn the heat on for the second pot. Now, one of the reasons why I don't even turn the heat on to the second pot until I start seeing simmering occurring in the first pot is very simple. This is quite lumpy. There's very liquidy liquid in there, and there's lumpy bits. And what we want is to make an actual sauce. So it will be more consistent in its texture, in its liquid to solid ratios. So this needs really about at least a quarter of an hour to gently simmer. So what I have found is that for the amount of time it takes me to bring this to a bubble and then add the linguine and then cook the linguine till a decent texture occurs, you're looking at about a quarter of an hour between bringing it to a bubble and then cooking the linguine. That gives the sauce plenty of time to cook down and become a sauce. I mean, if it takes you 20 minutes till you're ready to do that, that's fine. I mean, giving this a little bit more time is a great way of getting the sauce to have a really beautiful consistency. Rushing it is where you're going to have problems. So if I started boiling the water before I got to the stage where this was simmering, the linguine would be ready too early and the sauce wouldn't have its proper texture yet. I'm going to give it a few more moments actually, because this isn't, I sort of went down in temperature a little bit quickly here, and so it's not quite bubbling the way I want it to yet. But in fact, I'm going to raise the temperature on that just slightly. There we go. Now I'm going to just drop it back down again to simmering temperature. And now that'll simmer gently. So I'm now going to begin to heat up the water. I will put the lid on that to let that heat up a little bit faster. But this will take a little while to come to a bubble. And in the meantime, this is just cooking beautifully. So you stir this periodically, and now suddenly that water is boiling vigorously. So we take the linguine, pop it in. I'm going to reduce the temperature of that slightly, and with a fork we're just going to gently spread it out a bit. Obviously, linguine, spaghetti, this sort of thing tends to be longer than the pot is round, so just gently does it. As it begins to heat up and absorb some of the liquid, some of the heat, it becomes soft and begins to bend. Don't be in a rush, but it's pretty easy to tamp in there. And once it's curled round enough to be inside of the pot, we just maneuver it around a bit. One of the things we don't want is for the linguine to stick to itself, and I know some people pour olive oil in there, and that is a trick that I gather works quite well. I don't usually bother with that. I just use a little manipulation with the fork, which works fine for me. We're going to give that a chance to come back to a bubble. Give this a gentle stir. It's had sort of 6 or 7 minutes to bring it up to the bubble. Obviously, having salt in the water means that it boils at a slightly higher temperature, so it does take a tiny bit longer to come up to the boil in the first instance. But as long as this is gently bubbling, and that's not bubbling too vigorously, a good bubble, yes, but we don't want it boiling over. It will soften. Again, we will periodically agitate it, move it around so it doesn't stick too much to itself. And this is also a good way of monitoring how soft it gets. Now, some people prefer it to be very, very soft, others prefer al dente. That is purely a matter for you to decide. In terms of quantity, I usually recommend about 125 grams of pasta per person. If you have someone with a little appetite, they might only want as much as 100 grams. If they have a big appetite, maybe 150, but give or take 25 grams, you're looking at about 125 per person. For those of you who prefer to work in ounces, that actually works out roughly between 4 and 5 ounces per person. If you think in terms of 4.5 ounces per person on average, you're probably not too far off. I mean, here in the UK, I buy pasta in packets of 500 grams. To put that into context, a pound is about 450 grams, so a 500 gram packet is just shy of 18 ounces. And half a packet is good for 2 people. A full packet would feed 4. So this has been cooking for, well, the pasta has been cooking for about 10-12 minutes. We're just going to give it a little taste. I know there is this old wives' tale about throwing pasta against the wall and seeing if it sticks to see if it's ready. I prefer to remove a single piece and just eat it. And if it's right, it's right, and if it's not, keep cooking. This is close. It's a little more al dente than I want, but I reckon another 2 or 3 minutes, and this should actually be really, really good. So again, we're just keeping it moving a little bit. You'll notice that the pasta is not sticking to it. It didn't need the olive oil. As I said, if you're going to stir the pot with a fork with the pasta, and just stay on top of it. It will separate beautifully. There's no need to pour olive oil in there. It just makes washing the dishes more difficult afterwards. So the pasta's been cooking for the best part of 20 minutes. So we'll turn that off. It's nice and tender, although a little bit al dente, which is just nice. And the next thing is to strain that in a colander. So at this point, once it's in the plate, ladle the sauce on top. That could be mixed together, and we end up with an amazing dinner. Add a little Parmesan, some salad, and you have a healthy, balanced, nutritious meal that's delicious too. I hope you enjoyed that, because eating it, I certainly did. I will say that it's easy. Give it a try. And variations on the theme allow real diversity of flavors. It's not hard to modify this recipe to make it your own. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please click like. It really helps with the algorithm. And consider subscribing. Consider sharing. And if you have something to say, feel free to comment. And I hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one.